The smell of pine and cold stone had followed Daniel Cole every morning for the past 6 years, and he never once got tired of it. He was checking the ropes on his pack when the radio on his belt crackled with a voice he did not expect to hear this early. It was his neighbor, an old woman named Grace who lived 2 miles down the slope and kept goats. Her voice was shaking. "Daniel," she said, "turn on your radio. The real one. Not this thing." He frowned and walked into his cabin, flipping the switch on the old wooden set that sat by the fireplace. Static filled the room for a second, then a news anchor's voice came through, tight and fast, the kind of voice people use when they are trying not to sound scared. Reports are coming in from every continent. Mountain ranges that have held dragon populations for centuries are now reporting zero activity. The Greywatch Range, the Iron Teeth, the Sunfall Cliffs, even the remote peaks of the southern islands. All empty. Scientists are calling this the largest unexplained animal disappearance in recorded history. Daniel sat down slowly in his chair. He did not feel shocked the way he probably should have. He felt something closer to guilt, heavy and sudden, sitting right in his chest. Grace's goats bleated outside her window, and she must have been standing close to her own radio, because he could hear the broadcast doubled, once through the cabin speaker and once faint and delayed through his own handheld unit. "Daniel, did you know about this?" she asked. "You spend more time up near those cliffs than anyone alive." He did not answer right away. Instead, he looked out his window toward the mountain that had been part of his life since he was a young man with a notebook and a dream of understanding the earth better than anyone before him. The peak was silent. No wings. No shadows crossing the morning sun. For 6 years there had always been at least one dragon visible from his porch at this hour. Usually an old one named Varash, who liked to sit on the highest ledge and watch the sunrise the same way Daniel did. Today there was nothing but empty rock and a thin layer of morning fog. "I have to go check something," he told Grace, and clicked off the radio before she could ask more questions. He grabbed his boots and his old field journal, the same leather one he had carried since his days as a young researcher, and stepped outside. The mountain air was colder than usual, or maybe it only felt that way because the world suddenly seemed so much bigger and so much emptier at the same time. By noon, 3 black vehicles were parked outside his cabin. Men and women in gray jackets stepped out, moving with the kind of confidence that comes from official orders and very little patience. Their leader was a woman with sharp eyes and a folder full of papers under her arm. "Mr. Cole," she said, not bothering with a greeting first. "You're the closest human resident to Greywatch Peak. Satellite records show dragon movement near your property 3 nights ago, right before every dragon on the planet vanished. We need to know what you saw." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Behind her, other agents were already setting up equipment, scanning the mountain with instruments that beeped and blinked. He thought about lying. It would have been easy enough. He could say he saw nothing, that he was asleep, that the storm that night had kept him inside with the shutters closed. But lying had never been something he was good at, and something told him this was too big to hide, even if part of him wanted to protect the secret a little longer. "You should come inside," he said instead. "This is going to take a while to explain, and you're not going to believe most of it at first." The woman exchanged a look with one of her colleagues, then nodded and followed him through the door. Behind her, 2 more agents stayed outside, cameras aimed at the empty mountain, waiting for something that was not going to come back that day. Inside, Daniel poured himself a cup of black coffee he did not really want, more out of habit than thirst, and set his old journal on the table between them. The leather cover was worn soft at the edges from years of handling, and there were coordinates written in his own handwriting on the very last page, coordinates he had never shown to another living soul until 3 nights ago. "There's a place under the equator," he began, "that most people don't know exists. I found it years ago, back when I still thought I was going to be a famous geologist instead of a mountain guide. Nobody cared about it back then because there was nothing valuable down there. No oil, no minerals worth mining, nothing that made money." The woman across from him narrowed her eyes. "What does that have to do with the dragons?" Daniel took a slow breath, the kind you take before saying something that is going to change how people look at you forever. 3 nights ago," he said, "an old dragon came to my door. He was dying, and he wasn't the only one. All of them were dying, slowly, for longer than any of us realized. And I think I might be the only person alive who knows exactly where they went and why they trusted me enough to go there. The room went completely silent except for the low hum of the agent's equipment outside, still searching an empty sky for something that had already left to find its cure, far below the surface of the world. Rain had been falling for 2 straight hours on the night. Everything changed, and Daniel remembered thinking it was the kind of storm that made the whole mountain feel like it was breathing. He had been reading by lamplight, half asleep in his chair, when a sound like falling boulders shook the porch outside his cabin. He grabbed the old rifle he never actually planned to use and opened the door carefully, only to freeze at what he saw. A massive shape was curled against the side of his cabin, wings pressed tight to its body, scales dulled and cracked in places where they should have shone like polished stone. It was Varash. Daniel recognized him instantly, even in this state, from the pale scar across his left eye that had been there since before Daniel first arrived at Greywatch. "You are hurt," Daniel said, lowering the rifle immediately and stepping out into the rain. The dragon's voice came into his mind the way it always did, not through sound but through something deeper, a kind of pressure behind his thoughts that had taken him years to get used to. It was weaker now than he had ever heard it. "Not hurt," Varash said. "Dying. Slowly. As my brothers and sisters are dying, across every range on this world." Daniel stood frozen in the rain, water running down his face, unable to find words for a long moment. He had known Varash for 6 years, ever since the old dragon had first landed near his cabin out of curiosity about the strange human who mapped rocks for a living instead of hunting them for treasure. Over time, curiosity had become something like friendship, though Daniel had never been foolish enough to think he truly understood a creature that had lived for centuries before he was born. "How long has this been happening?" Daniel asked, finally finding his voice. "Longer than you have been alive," Varash answered. "It moves slowly, like frost creeping through stone. Our blood carries the sickness from the mountains themselves, deep within the rock we nest upon. For generations we believed it was simply the way our kind grew old. Only recently did the elders understand it was something else. A poison, seeping upward from far below, changing us a little more with every year that passes." Daniel helped him toward the shelter of the cliff overhang beside his cabin, though there was little a human of his size could really do to move a creature so much larger than himself. Varash mostly moved on his own, guided more by Daniel's presence than his strength. "Why haven't the dragons asked for help before now?" Daniel asked once they were out of the worst of the rain. Varash's eyes, still sharp despite his weakened body, fixed on Daniel with something that looked almost like shame. "Pride," he said simply. "We are an old species, Daniel Cole. Older than your cities, older than your written language. To admit weakness to a species as young as yours felt, to many of my kind, like a wound greater than the sickness itself. We believed we could heal ourselves. We were wrong." Daniel sat down on the wet stone beside him, his mind racing through years of old research, papers nobody had wanted to fund, expeditions that had been shut down before he could finish them properly. "What changed?" he asked. "Why come to me tonight?" "Because you know something none of us ever bothered to learn," Varash said. "You mapped the deep earth beneath the equator, long ago, when you were young and full of hope for what science could still discover. I remember you telling me of it, many years past, sitting on this very mountain, describing formations rich with minerals that could purify tainted blood if only someone knew where to find them." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He did remember that conversation, a lazy afternoon years earlier when he had talked with Varash about his old, unfinished research simply because the dragon had asked, and Daniel had nobody else left in his life who wanted to listen to a scientist's forgotten dreams. "You want the coordinates," Daniel said slowly. "I want more than that," Varash answered. "I want you to trust that giving them to me will not be a mistake, even though it means every dragon on this world may vanish from human sight for a time. There is no other way. We must go deep into the hollow beneath the equator and remain there long enough for the healing minerals to work through generations of poison. It will take time. It will frighten your people." Daniel thought of the government agents who would surely come asking questions, of the panic that would spread once the mountains fell silent, of everything that could go wrong if this secret ever became twisted into something political or dangerous. But he also thought of 6 years of quiet mornings watching dragons circle the peaks, of a friendship built slowly and carefully between two very different kinds of minds, and of the simple fact that he could not let a friend die simply because the truth might be inconvenient. He walked back into his cabin, soaked through and shivering, and pulled his old leather journal from the shelf where it had sat untouched for years. His hands were not quite steady as he turned to the last page, where faded ink still marked the exact coordinates of a hollow deep beneath the equatorial range, a place he had once believed the world would never care about. "Here," he said, kneeling beside Varash and holding the open page toward him. "Everything I found. Everything I never got to finish studying." Varash studied the page for a long moment, then looked up at Daniel with something that felt, even now, like gratitude too large for words. "You may have just saved my entire kind, Daniel Cole," the dragon said quietly. "I hope your kind forgives you for it." 3 nights later, every dragon on the planet was gone, and Daniel Cole sat alone on his porch, watching an empty sky, wondering if he had just done something wonderful or something the world would never let him live down. 20 years before dragons became the biggest mystery on the planet, a younger version of Daniel Cole had spent 18 months crawling through underground caves with a team of 6 other scientists, all of them convinced they were about to discover something that would change the field of geology forever. He remembered that time now as he sat across from the sharp-eyed government agent, whose name he had learned was Director Wren, and tried to explain a piece of his life nobody outside that old research team had ever cared about. "The equatorial hollow," Daniel said, tapping his finger against the worn map spread across his kitchen table, "was supposed to be the discovery of my career. We found evidence of a massive underground formation, untouched by surface weather for millions of years, full of rare minerals nobody had ever properly studied." Director Wren studied the map with narrowed eyes. "And nobody else knows about this place?" "The funding got pulled before we finished mapping it properly," Daniel said. "No oil down there. No gold. Just strange minerals that didn't have any commercial use back then. The company sponsoring us decided it wasn't worth the money, and the whole project got shelved. My team scattered to other jobs. I ended up here, guiding hikers and studying dragons instead of rocks." "But you kept your notes," Wren said, not quite a question. "I keep everything," Daniel answered simply. "Old habit." He explained, as clearly as he could, what he had told Varash 3 nights earlier, watching Wren's expression shift from skepticism to something more complicated as the pieces started fitting together in her mind. Outside, more agents had arrived, and Daniel could hear equipment being unpacked, drones being prepped, voices speaking in the clipped tones of people trying to control a situation that was already far beyond their control. "You're telling me," Wren said slowly, "that every dragon on this planet migrated underground, all at once, in a single coordinated movement, based on data you gave to one dragon 3 days ago?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Daniel said. Wren leaned back in her chair, running a hand through her hair, clearly trying to decide whether the man in front of her was a hero, a fool, or something far more dangerous than either. "Do you understand how this looks, Mr. Cole? A single human, alone in the mountains, with private knowledge of a location that suddenly becomes the destination for every dragon on the planet. Some people are going to ask if you planned this. Some people are going to ask worse questions than that." Daniel felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He had expected disbelief, maybe even anger, but he had not fully considered how suspicious the whole situation might sound from the outside, stripped of the years of quiet trust that had built up between himself and Varash. "I didn't plan anything," he said firmly. "A dying friend asked for help, and I gave him the only thing I had that could possibly save his people. That's the whole story." Wren studied him for a long moment before finally nodding, though her expression remained guarded. "I believe you," she said. "But belief and proof are different things, and right now half the governments on this planet are demanding answers I don't have. You're about to become either the most trusted man alive or the most hunted, and there isn't much middle ground left." By evening, the story had leaked to the press, though nobody was quite sure how. News channels ran endless loops of footage showing empty mountain ranges alongside grainy old photographs of Daniel from his research days, 20 years younger and full of ambition nobody remembered anymore. Commentators argued over whether he was a hero who had saved an ancient species or a reckless man who had handed dangerous knowledge to creatures nobody fully understood. Grace called him that night, her voice tight with worry. "There are reporters camped outside my fence, Daniel. They're asking about you like you're some kind of criminal." "I'm sorry you're caught up in this," Daniel told her, watching through his window as unfamiliar vehicles began lining the road below his cabin, headlights cutting through the darkness like search beams. "Did you do the right thing?" she asked quietly. Daniel thought about Varash's weak voice in the rain, about years of quiet mornings watching dragons circle peaks that were now completely silent, about the trust a creature far older and wiser than himself had placed in a single stubborn human who refused to let old research gather dust forever. "I think so," he said. "I hope so." After the call ended, Daniel sat alone in his cabin for a long time, staring at his old journal, now sitting in a sealed evidence bag on his kitchen table at the government's insistence, as though it were a weapon instead of simply a record of forgotten dreams. Somewhere out there, deep beneath the equator, Varash and thousands of other dragons were fighting a slow and quiet battle against a sickness that had haunted their kind for centuries, and Daniel could do nothing now but wait, and hope, and try to survive the storm of suspicion that had suddenly surrounded his quiet mountain life. Outside, camera flashes lit up the night, and somewhere among the growing crowd, a single voice shouted the question that would follow Daniel Cole for months to come. "What are the dragons planning to do to us once they come back?" Daniel had no answer for that. He wasn't entirely sure the dragons had an answer either. All he knew for certain was that the world had changed overnight, and there was no way left to go back to how things used to be, only forward, into whatever came next. A week after the dragons disappeared, a reporter named Nora Bishop stood outside the barricade near Daniel's cabin, holding a microphone she had not turned on yet, watching the chaos around her with the tired eyes of someone who had covered too many disasters in too short a time. She had known Daniel once, years earlier, back when they were both young and ambitious and working the same failed research project beneath the equator. She had gone into journalism after the funding collapsed. He had gone into the mountains. Neither of them had spoken in almost 15 years, until his face started appearing on every news channel in the world. She found him chopping firewood behind his cabin, a strange, ordinary task for a man suddenly at the center of a global mystery. "You look the same," she said, stepping over a fallen branch. "Older, but the same." Daniel looked up, surprised, then let out a short laugh that held very little humor in it. "Nora Bishop, I wondered if you'd show up eventually. Everyone in my field is trying to get an interview with you," she admitted. "I figured an old research partner might actually get you to talk honestly, instead of the rehearsed answers you've been giving the government." Daniel set down his axe and wiped his hands on his jeans. "I haven't been rehearsing anything. I've just been telling the truth to people who don't want to believe it." Nora studied him carefully. "Some people think you're lying. Some think you're a hero. And there's a growing group who thinks something much worse. That you and the dragons are planning something together. That this whole disappearance was staged to weaken human defenses before some kind of takeover." Daniel felt a tired anger rise in his chest, though he tried to keep his voice calm. "That's ridiculous, and you know it. Dragons were dying, Nora. Whole populations, hidden away out of pride, wasting away in silence for longer than either of us has been alive. I gave a dying friend information that might save his species. That's the entire story. There's no conspiracy hiding underneath it." Before Nora could respond, a young man in a military uniform approached from the direction of the checkpoint, moving with careful respect despite his obvious authority. He introduced himself as Corporal Wade, part of the team assigned to escort Daniel on an upcoming expedition to verify his claims firsthand. "Mr. Cole," Wade said, "Director Wren wants you to lead a small team down to the coordinates you gave. Scientists, a few soldiers, and apparently," he glanced briefly at Nora, "a journalist as well, since public trust in the official story is running low." Daniel exchanged a glance with Nora, who raised an eyebrow with the kind of expression that suggested she had already known this was coming before he did. "When do we leave?" Daniel asked. 3 days, Wade answered. "Enough time to prepare equipment for an environment nobody fully understands yet." Over those 3 days, Daniel found himself pulled into briefings, equipment checks, and long conversations with scientists eager to pick apart every detail of his old research. Wade, despite his youth, proved sharper than Daniel expected, asking careful questions about dragon behavior and mountain geology that showed he had actually done his homework rather than simply following orders blindly. "You really trust them," Wade said one evening, as they reviewed old maps together by lamplight. "The dragons, I mean. Even after everything that's happened." "I trusted one dragon," Daniel corrected gently. "Varash, trust like that doesn't come easily, and it definitely doesn't come from a single conversation or a news report. It comes from years of small moments most people never see." Meanwhile, far beneath the equator, though Daniel had no way of knowing the details yet, Varash Old Wing moved slowly through a vast cavern lit by strange glowing minerals embedded in the rock walls. Thousands of dragons rested there, weak but no longer fading, their scales beginning to regain a faint shine that had been missing for longer than most of them could remember. The healing was slow, almost too slow to notice day by day, but Varash could feel it working, a warmth spreading through blood that had carried cold poison for generations. He also felt something else stirring, a tension among certain human forces gathering near the surface entrances to the hollow, forces that did not share the patience or good intentions of Director Wren's careful investigation. Back at the surface, a hardline faction within the military, led by officials frustrated with what they saw as a foolish, dangerous alliance forming with an unknown species, began making plans of their own. They saw an opportunity in the dragon's weakened state, a chance to establish dominance before the ancient creatures fully recovered their strength. Quiet orders were given. Extra troops moved toward the equatorial region without official clearance from Director Wren's office. Daniel knew nothing of this yet, focused entirely on preparing for the expedition that would take him back to the very place his forgotten research had once mapped so carefully. He only sensed, in the way experienced people sometimes sense danger before they can name it, that something larger and more complicated than a simple rescue mission was beginning to take shape. On the morning the expedition finally departed, Nora walked beside him toward the waiting transport vehicles, notebook in hand, watching him with an expression somewhere between old friendship and professional curiosity. "Are you scared?" she asked quietly, away from the cameras and other listening ears. Daniel considered the question honestly before answering. "Terrified," he admitted. "Not of the dragons. Of what my own people might do once they see them vulnerable." Nora said nothing more, but she wrote his answer down carefully, sensing, correctly, that it would matter a great deal before this story finally reached its end. The descent into the hollow took nearly 9 hours, and by the time Daniel's boots finally touched the strange, smooth stone floor of the outer cavern, his legs ached in ways he had forgotten were possible after years of easier mountain trails. The tunnel system leading down from the surface had been carved partly by nature and partly, it seemed, by the dragons themselves during their sudden migration, wide enough for creatures many times larger than any human to pass through comfortably. Corporal Wade walked close beside him, flashlights sweeping across walls that gradually began to glow faintly on their own the deeper they traveled, a soft blue light coming from veins of mineral embedded directly into the rock. "This is incredible," Wade whispered, unable to keep the awe out of his voice despite months of military discipline. "I've never seen anything like this." Nora walked just behind them, recording everything on a small camera strapped to her jacket, her earlier skepticism slowly giving way to something closer to wonder as the tunnel opened into a massive underground chamber unlike anything any of them had imagined. Thousands of dragons filled the space below, resting on wide stone shelves carved naturally into the cavern walls, their scales catching the blue glow of the minerals and reflecting it back in shifting patterns of light. Some were massive, ancient creatures who looked as old as the mountains themselves. Others were smaller, younger dragons curled protectively near their elders. The sound of slow, steady breathing filled the enormous space like a living heartbeat. Daniel felt his own breath catch in his throat at the sight. He had seen individual dragons his whole adult life, but nothing had prepared him for the scale of an entire species gathered together in one place, vulnerable and healing all at once. A familiar voice touched his mind before he even spotted the source. "You came," Varash said, his presence pushing gently through Daniel's thoughts the way it always had, though noticeably stronger now than it had been that rainy night on his porch. Daniel turned and found the old dragon making his way carefully across the cavern floor, his scales already showing signs of recovery. Cracks that had once marked failing health now closing slowly into smooth, healthy patterns. "You're healing," Daniel said, relief flooding through him at the sight. Slowly, Varash confirmed. "But surely, your data was accurate, Daniel Cole. More accurate than even I hoped it would be." Before Daniel could respond further, a commotion rose near one of the smaller side tunnels, voices shouting in urgent, clipped military tones that did not match the careful, respectful team Daniel had traveled down with. Wade's expression hardened instantly, his hand moving toward the radio on his belt. "That's not one of ours," he said grimly. Moments later, a group of soldiers emerged from the side tunnel, weapons raised, moving with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from orders given far above Director Wren's official authority. Their leader, a heavy-set officer with cold eyes, scanned the massive cavern with open greed rather than wonder. "Stand down," Wade shouted, stepping forward despite being outnumbered. "This expedition is under Director Wren's direct command. You have no authorization to be here." The officer sneered. "Wren's playing diplomat with monsters while the rest of us protect actual human interests. Look at them. Weak. Vulnerable. This is the only chance we'll ever get to establish real control before they're strong enough to threaten us again." Around the cavern, dragons began stirring, low growls rippling through the massive space as thousands of ancient creatures sensed the sudden threat despite their weakened state. Daniel felt his heart pound as he realized how quickly this could spiral into something impossible to undo. A single spark away from violence that could destroy everything Varash and his people had sacrificed so much to achieve. "Stop," Daniel said loudly, stepping directly between the hostile soldiers and the nearest dragons, ignoring Wade's sharp warning to get back. "Look around you. These aren't monsters plotting an attack. They're dying, or they were, until they trusted a stranger enough to risk everything on his word. If you attack them now, in the one moment they're vulnerable enough to actually need mercy, you'll prove every fear they've ever had about humanity was completely justified." The officer hesitated, clearly not expecting resistance from an unarmed civilian rather than the soldiers around him. Behind Daniel, Varash rose to his full height despite his weakened condition, his voice pushing into every mind in the chamber at once, dragon and human alike. "This human gave us the knowledge that saved our kind." Varash's voice echoed powerfully through their thoughts. "He asked for nothing in return. If your kind chooses violence here, know that you attack not conquered enemies, but a species offering its trust for the very first time in 10,000 years." The weight of those words seemed to settle over the entire cavern, and even the hostile soldiers appeared shaken by the sheer presence of a mind so much older and vaster than their own touching theirs directly. Wade used the pause to step forward, radio finally connecting to Director Wren's command channel, relaying the situation with clear, urgent detail. Minutes felt like hours before Wren's authorization came through, official orders demanding the rogue faction stand down immediately or face serious consequences for endangering an unprecedented diplomatic opportunity. The heavy-set officer's jaw tightened with barely controlled anger, but eventually, seeing no support arriving and no path forward that did not end in disaster, he lowered his weapon and ordered his men to withdraw. As the tension slowly drained from the cavern, Varash lowered his massive head toward Daniel, close enough that Daniel could see his own reflection in eyes far older than any human had ever known. "You risked your life for us today," Varash said quietly, the words meant only for Daniel despite the crowded chamber around them. "Twice now, you have chosen trust over fear. My people will not forget this, Daniel Cole. Not for as long as dragons still fly beneath this sky." Nora, still recording everything with shaking hands, lowered her camera slowly, realizing she had just captured the exact moment the entire relationship between two species had been decided, not through treaties or negotiations, but through one man's simple refusal to let fear win. 6 months passed before the first dragons returned to Greywatch Peak, and Daniel Cole was standing on his porch, coffee cooling forgotten in his hand, when he saw the first pair of wings cut across the morning sky in years, or so it felt after the long silence. He nearly dropped the cup entirely, setting it down with clumsy haste on the porch railing before stepping out into the cold air for a better look. It was not Varash, not yet, but a younger dragon, scales a deep bronze color that caught the early sunlight beautifully as it circled the familiar peaks before landing gracefully on a ledge that had sat empty for what felt like an eternity. Daniel watched with a smile spreading slowly across his face, feeling something in his chest loosen that had been tight with worry since the night Varash first appeared, wounded, on this very porch. Grace called him within the hour, her voice bright with an excitement that matched his own. "Daniel, did you see it? Did you see it come back?" "I saw," he said, laughing for what felt like the first time in months. "This is really happening, Grace. They're actually coming home." Over the following weeks, more dragons returned in slow, steady waves, their numbers growing week by week as the healing deep beneath the equator continued its patient work. News crews that had once camped outside Daniel's cabin with suspicion and hostile questions now returned with a very different tone, eager to capture footage of the historic reunion between dragons and their ancestral mountains. Nora's original footage from inside the cavern had been released publicly weeks earlier, and it had changed public opinion almost overnight. Seeing Varash's words echo through the chamber, seeing Daniel step fearlessly between armed soldiers and vulnerable dragons, had done more to convince the world of Daniel's honest intentions than any official statement ever could have. The hardline military faction responsible for the confrontation in the cavern had been quietly but firmly dealt with, their leaders stripped of rank and command, a clear message sent that such reckless aggression would not be tolerated during such a delicate moment in history. Director Wren visited Daniel personally one crisp afternoon, several months after the initial crisis had calmed into something resembling careful, hopeful cooperation between human governments and dragon leadership. "Your old research," she said, setting a thick folder on his kitchen table, the same table where their very first difficult conversation had taken place. "It's being fully funded now. Properly this time. No corners cut, no budget concerns cutting the project short before it's finished." Daniel stared at the folder for a long moment before opening it slowly, finding pages of official documentation, government approval, and a level of scientific interest in his old, forgotten equatorial discovery that he had never dared hope to see in his lifetime. 20 years too late, he said quietly, though there was no real bitterness in his voice, only quiet satisfaction. "Maybe," Wren said, "or maybe exactly on time. If your project had been properly funded back then, who knows if the mapping data would have ever survived to reach a dying dragon on your porch when it mattered most. Sometimes the timing that seems wrong turns out to be exactly right." That evening, as the sun began to set behind Greywatch Peak, painting the sky in soft orange and gold, Daniel walked out to the ridge where he had spent countless mornings watching dragons circle overhead. The air felt different now, charged with a kind of hope that had been missing since the night the mountains first fell silent. A familiar presence touched his mind before he saw the massive shape descending gracefully from the darkening sky. Varash landed on the ridge beside him, scales fully restored now to their original brilliant shine, the pale scar across his eye the only visible reminder of the sickness that had once nearly claimed his life. "You look well," Daniel said warmly, reaching out to place his hand against the dragon's snout in a gesture of familiar affection built over years of quiet friendship. "Better than well," Varash replied, his mental voice carrying a strength Daniel had not heard in longer than he could remember. "The elders have asked me to deliver something to you, Daniel Cole. A title and used among our kind for many centuries, reserved only for those who prove trustworthy beyond any reasonable doubt." Daniel raised an eyebrow, curious despite himself. "What kind of title?" "Bonded friend," Varash said, the words carrying a weight that Daniel could feel even through the simple translation into human language. "It means our kind will remember your name and your kindness for as long as dragons remain upon this world. It means the friendship between us was never simply convenient. It was real, and it changed the future for both our species." Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion he had not expected, standing there on the familiar ridge as more dragons appeared in the distance, wings catching the last golden light of the setting sun, filling a sky that had been empty for far too long. "I know," Varash answered. "That is precisely why you deserve it." They stood together in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky, replaced slowly by stars, and the growing shapes of dragons returning home in greater numbers with each passing night. Daniel thought about the strange path that had brought him here, from a failed research project 20 years earlier to this quiet ridge, standing beside a creature whose trust had reshaped the relationship between two entire species. He thought about how the smallest, most overlooked pieces of forgotten knowledge could sometimes hold the power to change everything, if only someone cared enough to remember them, and brave enough to share them when it mattered most. Above Greywatch Peak, dragons filled the sky once more, their numbers slowly rebuilding with each passing season, carrying with them the beginning of a new era built not on fear or dominance, but on the simple, powerful truth that trust between two very different kinds of minds could accomplish what neither species could have managed entirely alone.